On August 20, 1940, in Coyoacán, Mexico, an exiled individual is engaged in scholarly writing when he is interrupted by a Stalinist agent who has stormed into his residence brandishing an ice axe. A struggle ensues between the two individuals before the agent successfully penetrates the man's skull and brain with the axe's adze, thereby thwarting his attack. Fortunately, the man's bodyguards arrive in time to prevent the agent's demise the next day at a hospital in Mexico City. His name is Leon Trotsky, indeed. Although the village of Yanivka in present-day central Ukraine was known as Leon Trotsky at the time of his birth, the 7th of November 1879, which is now considered to be a part of the Russian Empire, was not his given name at birth. Rather, it was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. His father, the comparatively prosperous Jewish Ukrainian farmer David Leontievich Bronstein, resided in an extremely remote region of Ukraine, more than 20 kilometers from the nearest post office. His mother was Anna Lvovna, and despite being Jewish, the family was not overly devout. Russian and Ukrainian were the predominant languages spoken within the household, as opposed to Yiddish, which was the customary tongue of Ashkenazi Jews. Leon's father enrolled him in school at Odessa, the principal city of the Crimea situated on the Black Sea in southern Ukraine, when he was 8 years old. He was exposed to an environment where a historically multicultural city was progressively Russifying, in accordance with imperial policy. During his time in Odessa, Leon orchestrated a strike against an unpopular teacher, which demonstrated his rebellious nature. The environment in which Trotsky was raised was fraught with turmoil. Russia had lagged behind its neighbors in Central and Western Europe in terms of political, cultural, and social development for centuries. However, this began to change in the 19th century. Between 1850 and 1900, the Russian population doubled, coal production increased 12-fold, and iron and steel production doubled. Significant technological advancements, including the railway system, telephones, and telegrams, facilitated increased interaction between Russia and its citizens and mainstream European ideas. As a result, a massive movement emerged in the mid-19th century with the aim of reforming Russian society and eradicating the autocracy and inequality that marked the rule of the autocratic emperors or czars. Russia became the final major European power to abolish serfdom in 1861, a practice that, while additional reforms were forthcoming, such as the relaxation of press censorship to facilitate the spread of political ideas and the emergence of new political factions in this more permissive political climate. Mikhail Bakunin, for instance, established modern collectivist anarchism in Russia during the mid-19th century. This theoretical framework advocated for the total abolition of centralized state authority as a reaction to the autocratic czarist regime. Additional factions, including the Emancipation of Labour Party and the Narodniks, advocated for socialism in Russia during the 1870s and 1880s in accordance with the political tenets of the German political theorist Karl Marx. Beginning in 1891, when a catastrophic famine claimed the lives of about 500,000 Russians, their causes began to gain traction in Russia. The unrest caused by the famine was so profound that Orlando Figes, the preeminent English-speaking figure, began to endorse these ideas. The occurrences of this era also seem to have had a significant impact on the young Trotsky, as he stated in his autobiography titled My Life, an attempt at an autobiography, published in the late 1920s, that 1891 was the official date of the political breaking point in this country. Trotsky's ideas were not isolated, and the Russian socialist movement experienced a surge in popularity during the 1890s due to the challenges posed by the famine. Initially composed of disparate socialist groups, they merged in 1898 to form the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a revolutionary socialist organization whose mission was to unite Russian socialists in their effort to improve the conditions of industrial workers in Russia. Lev Bronstein, the future Trotsky, was undeterred, and by 1898 he had joined the newly formed Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. In 1896, Trotsky had relocated to the Black Sea town of Nikolaev, where he had joined the Narodniks. The following year, He assisted in the organization of the South Russian Workers' Union in the town. Early in 1898, he was arrested for the first time due to his political activities. After being apprehended at Nikolaev in 1898, Trotsky was extradited to Moscow to stand trial for his involvement in orchestrating revolutionary factions in southern Ukraine. After a prolonged period of inactivity, he was sentenced to 4 years of arduous labor in Siberia in 1900. This vast, sparsely populated eastern region of Russia had functioned as a penal colony for dissenters opposing the Tsarist regime. However, his summertime matrimony to Alexandra Sokolovskaya helped to temper his ordeal in the east. After failing to complete his mandatory 4-year term in Siberia, Lev Bronstein fled the penal colony in the summer of 1902 by concealing himself in the back of a hay wagon, per his wife's advice. As he made his way back to Europe, Bronstein allegedly used a passport bearing the surname and alternative form of his first name of Trotsky, which he had obtained several years earlier from one of his prisoners in Odessa. After escaping Siberia, the newly liberated Leon Trotsky arrived in London, where he established communication with a number of prominent individuals affiliated with the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. These individuals had fled to England in exile due to repression of the party's membership by the Tsarist regime of Nicholas II. Among these exiles was Georgy Plekhanov, who was recognized as the progenitor of the social democratic movement in Russia and held the position of editor-in-chief of the Russian socialist publication Iskra, also known as the Spark, Iskra. Trotsky also encountered Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin as he became known, in London. Lenin, a contentious figure within the party, had published a pamphlet titled "What is to be Done?" in 1902. This sparked an extensive and contentious discussion within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party regarding the party's future. Lenin and other purists believed that the party should only seek the support of the bourgeois middle class and the industrial working class in opposition to the Tsarist regime and landowners. On the other hand, a separate faction advocated for the party to rally the support of the middle class in opposition to the Tsarist government. At the Second Congress of the party, which was jointly held in London and Brussels in August 1903, these divisions within the party reached their zenith. During this gathering, the party divided into two opposing factions, known as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The term Mensheviks denotes the minority, whereas Bolsheviks signifies the majority. The nomenclature reflected the outcome of a vote conducted at the party congress. However, this did not accurately reflect the actual support the two factions enjoyed. In fact, only a minority of the party membership supported the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, whereas the Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov, were the more popular and powerful of the two factions that emerged in the years following the 1903 split of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Trotsky, in an effort to reconcile the party's division, initially joined the Mensheviks. Nevertheless, by the autumn of 1904, his growing disillusionment with the Mensheviks' excessive courtship of Russian liberals and the Russian middle class led him to sever all ties with both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. For the next decade and a half, he operated as a prominent figure within the Russian socialist movement while remaining non-aligned. Trotsky's departure from the Mensheviks coincided with the most significant catalysts for political reform in Russia since the famine of 1891, on January 22, 1905. Father Georgy Gapon organized a sizable gathering of unarmed protesters traversing St. Petersburg en route to the Winter Palace of Nicholas II. The purpose of the demonstration was to voice opposition to the termination of several Putilov ironworks employees in the city, as opposed to the firing that had taken place at that time. Although he had not ordered the attacks, Bloody Sunday incited discontent around the Tsar Nicholas II. Strikes erupted in the majority of cities and industrial centers across the country. This revolution of 1905 was further propelled by Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, the first major military defeat in modern European history against an eastern state. Nicholas II re-established the Russia Duma, or parliament, in an effort to appease public opinion in the face of the escalating unrest caused by these events. However, by that time, The nation had entered a period of progressively radicalized politics, especially in the industrialized metropolises of St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Riga. Amidst the turmoil that ensued after Bloody Sunday, Trotsky made the decision to repatriate to Russia from his exile in Western Europe. After traversing Kiev in his native Ukraine, he arrived in St. Petersburg in the spring of 1905. There, he resumed utilizing his literary prowess by contributing to a variety of underground newspapers affiliated with the Mensheviks. However, his endeavors once more exposed him to surveillance and arrest risk from the Tsarist regime. Within weeks of his return, he was apprehended. Trotsky, who had been vacillating between Finland and St. Petersburg for the latter part of 1905, assumed control of the Russian Gazette and increased its readership to approximately 500,000 Russians. It was Trotsky's formation of councils or soviets of non-elected workers, which were intended to represent the labor force of the capital's factories, that he notably influenced. By the autumn of 1905, a St. Petersburg Soviet had been established. This position, that of chief agitator and author, was the cause of Trotsky's subsequent period of incarceration. Many prominent members of the St. Petersburg Soviet, including Trotsky, were apprehended by government troops in late 1905. He was subsequently convicted of inciting an uprising in St. Petersburg and spent the majority of 1906 in prison. Thus, in October 1906, Trotsky was once more sentenced to hard labor in Siberia. However, he did not serve his sentence. In fact, he failed to reach Siberia on this occasion. While en route to the east in the winters of 1906 or 1907, he once more evaded official custody and returned westward, ultimately returning to London in the course of 1907. However, Trotsky had already settled in Vienna within a few months. He continued his work in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for the majority of the following decade. It was in Vienna that he collaborated with the Russian Marxist and psychoanalyst Adolf Joff, commencing in 1908, on the publication of the clandestine Russian-language newspaper Pravda, which meant truth, and was smuggled into Russia. Attempts were made in 1912 to unify the various factions under the Russian socialist movement. Lenin convened a conference in Prague in January, where a number of Mensheviks joined the Bolsheviks. Trotsky then attempted to unite the factions once more in August, but to no avail. In addition to his participation in the Russian socialist movement while in exile in Vienna, Trotsky advanced his theoretical understanding of Marxism. In 1908, he released Results and Prospects, an extensive essay that expanded upon certain theoretical concepts he had formulated and documented in 1905 while in St. Petersburg following Bloody Sunday. In these writings, Trotsky expounded upon his permanent revolution, his outstanding contribution to Marxist theory. Trotsky further developed the notion put forth by Marx that in order to establish genuine political democracy and the redistribution of land and wealth, as a preliminary measure towards establishing a communist society, segments of the middle-class bourgeoisie would be obligated to execute a revolution. Trotsky postulated that the bourgeoisie in Russia could not be relied upon to make such contributions to the revolution. Therefore, the proletariat or working lower classes would have to undertake these responsibilities as part of a class struggle that would have to continue indefinitely until communism was achieved. This theory has had a significant influence on Marxist thought throughout the 20th century, extending beyond Russia. During his residence in Vienna in 1912, Trotsky reported on the ethnic cleansing policies of the Serbian army against the Albanian people, showcasing his enduring interest in class and ethnic struggles of all kinds. Throughout this period, Trotsky covered the conflicts that ravaged the Balkans. Trotsky's exiled career was significantly influenced by the Balkans. In the summer of 1914, the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ignited the spark that eventually ignited into the First World War. By the end of August 1914, Europe was divided into two opposing alliances: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Trotsky, a Russian émigré, was a member of one of these alliances. Trotsky joined the Swiss Socialist Party in Switzerland and authored The War and the International, a book in which he expressed his opposition to the war. This stands in contrast to several socialist parties across Europe, which had supported the conflict for domestic reasons that varied. The perpetually nomadic Trotsky once more relocated in 1916 due to his anti-war stance. In early 1917, he was arrested in France and deported to neutral Spain on account of his anti-war stance. By early 1917, he had returned to the United States, where he had briefly resided in the Bronx, New York City. The pivotal moment for the Russian socialist movement transpired during his sojourn in New York. This was due to the Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Russia's performance in the 1914–1915 World War II, which severely destabilized the domestic political climate in Russia, and the fact that Tsar Nicholas II, who had assumed personal command of the Russian armies in 1915, was held personally accountable for a sequence of catastrophic military setbacks. Critically, the substantial borrowing and money printing to finance the war effort had resulted in rapid inflation in Russia. By 1917, the price of essential food items had escalated fourfold from their value in 1914, pushing the impoverished to the verge of destitution. This, coupled with worsening food shortages, contributed to the rise of more radical political movements within the country. Lenin, who had been exiled in Western Europe, advocated for a transformation of the war effort into a civil war. This discontentment was not mitigated by the Tsar's family within the government. Alexandra, the Tsarina and wife of Nicholas II, was born in Germany. As Russia lost the war to Germany, her nationality became a subject of censure and suspicion. Furthermore, the royal family had developed a growing confidence in the prowess of Grigory Rasputin, a mystic who had formed a friendship with the Tsar's family and whom the general public progressively perceived as the source of power. Early in 1917, these social, political, and economic factors in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was known after 1914, a city whose population had increased from around 1 million in 1890 to more than 2 million in 1917, with many of its inhabitants being impoverished, overworked, and profoundly disillusioned industrial laborers, came together in a state of severe unrest. In early February 1917, laborers in Petrograd initiated strikes and demonstrations across the city. Notably, strikes commenced at the Putilov mill, the city's largest employer with over 20,000 employees. The strike was instigated by the company's failure to honor a promised pay rise, which had been intended to alleviate the workers' concerns regarding the escalated cost of food in the capital. Subsequent to the strike, a lockout from the factory ensued, which in turn instigated additional events transpired swiftly. While the Tsar was away from the capital on the Eastern Front, he ordered the army to suppress the rioting and demonstrations in the capital. This decision backfired, however, as a significant number of rank-and-file soldiers deserted or refused to comply. In the interim, the Duma, the Russian parliament, moved to establish a committee to ensure law and order. Concurrently, efforts were underway to establish a Soviet or city council of the industry. Nicholas II, meanwhile, was returning to the capital from the Eastern Front under mounting pressure to abdicate as the situation in Petrograd spiraled out of control. Senior members of the Russian military confronted him and urged him to do so. Consequently, he abdicated on March 15, 1917, in favor of his brother Michael. However, on March 16, 1917, he renounced the title of Tsar after realizing he lacked the support to restore order. A provisional government, led by a liberal aristocrat named Prince Georgy Lvov, assumed power at this time. Although the Petrograd Soviet maintained the majority of power within the city, a power struggle ensued between the populist Socialist Soviet and the aristocratic conciliar government over the next 8 months. Trotsky commenced preparations to return to his native land as soon as he received word of the events in Russia, which reached him in New York. He left the United States on March 27, 1917, and was detained for a month at Nova Scotia while crossing the Atlantic. During his time in a British internment camp, he assisted in the organization of workers' agitation and mass gatherings. Ultimately, the British government released Trotsky at the conclusion of his detention. In the weeks following the February Revolution, Lenin swiftly established the Bolsheviks as one of the preeminent factions in the polarized politics of Russia upon his return to Petrograd from Western Europe in mid-April. Ultimately, he emerged as a significant figure in the materializing struggle. In spite of his previous lack of allegiance to the Bolsheviks or Mensheviks, Trotsky gradually embraced Lenin's stance, which grew more intent on overthrowing the provisional aristocratic administration and installing a socialist government. Following government crackdowns on certain militant factions in Petrograd, Lenin fled across the border into Finland. Nevertheless, a military coup d'état in September 1917 failed to establish dominance in Russia. Lenin returned to the capital in October. Upon his return, the Bolshevik Central Committee voted to incite a rebellion and seize power, not only in response to the failed military coup d'état, but also in response to significant developments within the government. It is impossible to overstate Trotsky's contribution to the revolution that ensued after Lenin returned to the capital. On the evening of October 22, the Petrograd Soviet passed a resolution in which he authored a resolution that demanded the establishment of a military revolutionary center. This center would facilitate the revolutionary defense of Petrograd and ensure the safety of the people from the attacks openly planned by military and civilian Kornilovites. The subsequent uprising transpired during the evening of November 7, 1917. However, it has since been referred to as the October Revolution, since it transpired on October 25, as the Julian calendar was in use in Russia during that period. Trotsky, who was designated chairman of the Revolutionary Military Committee, played a pivotal role in the October Revolution's successful coup against the Bolsheviks in Petrograd by successfully converting the capital's garrison to their cause. Consequently, numerous government facilities in the capital were occupied within 24 hours of the revolt's inception. On November 9, the Winter Palace, the actual seat of government, was captured by Lenin, his party, and the Petrograd Soviet. The lengthy and tumultuous annals of the Soviet state thus commenced. The establishment of the Soviet state in Russia was accompanied by swift policy shifts towards the establishment of a communist state. On November 15, Moscow endorsed the new regime. All private property and Russian banks were nationalized, foreign debt defaulted. The extensive holdings of the Russian Orthodox Church were seized by the state, and factories were occupied by Soviet workers. These developments transpired within days. During the initial weeks of the Soviet state, Trotsky rose to prominence due to his involvement in the October Revolution and the high regard he received from members of the Petrograd Soviet. During these nascent days of the revolution, only Lenin possessed greater influence within the new regime. His subsequent actions in the months that followed demonstrated his status as the second most powerful figure in the Soviet-Russian government. Trotsky assumed the position of People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs in November 1917, the Soviet equivalent of the Minister for Foreign Affairs. His initial responsibility was to publish the terms of the Triple Entente, an alliance comprising Tsarist Russia, France, and Britain. The alliance had reached an agreement to redraw the borders of Europe and redistribute the lands of the Central Powers among itself. This was in opposition to Russia's disastrous 1917 war effort. Simultaneously, Trotsky initiated peace negotiations with the German government in Berlin in an effort to end Russia's participation in the First World War. These negotiations commenced in December 1917, and the Germans immediately imposed severe conditions, including the annexation of vast portions of the Russian Empire, including portions of modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic Sea region. The Petrograd regime initially held strong reservations regarding the terms proposed by Germany. However, beginning in early 1918, it encountered mounting resistance from Central Russian states against the formation of the Soviet Union. Given the impending civil war at home and the Russian army's inability to resume operations on the Eastern Front, the regime reluctantly consented to the majority of Germany's terms by the spring of 1918. Trotsky, who abhorred agreeing to territorial concessions to a capitalist regime, abstained from voting on the decision to accept the German terms that he had supervised the negotiation of. He had anticipated that the German proletariat would overthrow the Kaiser's government in Berlin while the negotiations were in progress. However, his faith in the revolutionary cause was dashed on this occasion. In accordance with the provisions outlined in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was ratified on March 3, 1918, and obtained its name from the Belarusian town where it was reached, the nascent Soviet state relinquished to Germany the entirety of its territories in Poland, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and certain regions in the Caucasus and Caspian Sea area. Russia additionally acknowledged the autonomy of Finland, Ukraine, and Georgia, thereby establishing additional buffer states along its borders. The cumulative devastation exceeded 1 million square miles of Russian land, 55 million inhabitants, and a significant portion of Russia's coal, iron, and steel plants. Lenin expressed unequivocally that this was an honorable defeat, but the treaty gave the Soviet state sufficient time to fortify its defenses against domestic adversaries. A broad coalition of aristocrats, former Tsarist regime supporters, Cossacks, army officers, the Orthodox Church, centrists, and even leftists who opposed the Bolsheviks had begun organizing themselves into an opposing White Army by the time peace was established with the Germans in the spring of 1918. They received substantial international support in the form of aid from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. Although less significant, other factions emerged in regions such as the Ukraine, including the Green Army and Black Army, with the objective of safeguarding local rights against the Soviet regime headquartered in Petrograd. After presiding over the peace negotiations with Germany, Trotsky assumed a prominent role in the Soviet war effort during the height of the Civil War. In mid-March, shortly after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was finalized, he tendered his resignation as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs and was subsequently designated as People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. In essence, Trotsky was entrusted with command of the Soviet war effort. The leader encountered initial challenges in the form of a small and unprofessional Red Army. As a result, his first action was to organize an enormous recruitment drive. Within 6 months of assuming command, the Red Army amassed 1 million troops from 300,000 men. This figure would eventually increase to 3 million as new fronts emerged, most notably in Poland beginning in early 1919 when Polish separatists initiated the Polish-Soviet War. Trotsky's approach during his tenure as Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs could be characterized as severe. To promote greater discipline among the lower ranks, he devised the infamous blocking units, which were positioned behind the front lines of the Red Army and tasked with eliminating any of their own soldiers suspected of attempting to desert or retreat. Years later, in his autobiography, he elaborated on this notion: an army cannot be constructed without reputation. In order to execute large numbers of soldiers, the army command must possess the death penalty. It will continue to be necessary for the command to position soldiers between the risk of death in the foreground and the inevitability of death in the rear as long as those malevolent tailless apes, whom we refer to as men, construct armies and wage wars. These blocking units remained a prevalent characteristic of the Red Army for an extended period of time and were utilized extensively once more throughout the Second World War. However, beyond this ruthless strategy for enforcing discipline, with fervent revolutionary and communist ideals, he deemed such actions morally justifiable provided they resulted in the obliteration of the bourgeoisie and the establishment of a new socialist global order. In this regard, his conduct throughout the Russian Revolution exemplified an individual capable of exhibiting a ruthless side that frequently contradicted his concern for the rights of the oppressed proletariat. Furthermore, numerous of his strategies influenced the course of history. Trotsky's leadership of the Red Army had previously introduced him to Joseph Stalin, an up-and-coming figure of the Soviet regime hailing from Georgia. Stalin had become a close associate of Lenin in 1917 and had been entrusted with command over army components in 1918, notably on the southern front in the Caucasus, which was in close proximity to Trotsky's native Georgia. During the autumn of 1918, Trotsky endeavored to designate General Pavel Sitin as the Red Army commander in the meantime. In late 1919, a significant development occurred in the Civil War. Several White Army factions, Polish forces, and military contingents from newly independent states including Finland and Estonia threatened Petrograd and Moscow. These adversaries were backed by foreign assistance from Britain, the United States, and France. Nevertheless, the Red Army ultimately launched an offensive in the winter of 1919–20, following the conclusion of the Polish-Soviet War in late autumn. In October 1922, the final city held by the White Army along the Pacific coast of Russia, Vladivostok, surrendered to the Red Army. At the conclusion of hostilities, the Soviet state had lost a portion of the territory that it had previously occupied under the Tsarist Russian Empire. This loss was most pronounced in Poland and the Baltic region, where the independent states of Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had yet to fully solidify their positions. However, Russia had managed to retain the majority of its territorial holdings. Following 5 years of revolution, civil war, and unrest, the Soviet state shifted its attention towards the reconstruction and restructuring of the economy in accordance with socialist ideals. In 1921, Lenin's government initiated the implementation of the new economic policy, a market-oriented economic strategy that permitted limited private property ownership and incorporated several other capitalist elements. The NEP, as it has since been referred to, was initially designed as a transient retreat from more extreme socialist policies. During the ongoing Civil War emergency, Trotsky vehemently opposed it. Trotsky, who had positioned himself at the extreme left of the Soviet hierarchy by the early 1920s, was a member of the Leninist government, but it did not descend into a dictatorship similar to that which developed during the 1930s under Stalin. Trotsky firmly held the Marxist and socialist view that the state ought to possess absolute authority over the distribution of all production and that Russia ought to establish an exemplary command economy. However, notwithstanding his and the other left-leaning Soviet leadership members' objections, the NEP was implemented. In fact, it persisted well beyond the war's conclusion and served as the fundamental framework for the Soviet economy until 1928. Concurrently, with the conclusion of the Civil War, Lenin's health started to decline, giving rise to significant uncertainties regarding his successor as leader of the Soviet state. From May 1922 to March 1923, he endured 3 strokes, which ultimately resulted in partial paralysis and the loss of all motor functions, including speech. Upon his demise on January 21, 1924, the Soviet hierarchy, commonly referred to as the Politburo, was in place. As Lenin's health declined starting in 1921, it became evident that 2 prominent individuals, Trotsky or Stalin, could ostensibly succeed him as the leader of the Soviet state. Trotsky had been Lenin's effective number 2 in the administration since the October Revolution of 1917. His leadership of the Red Army had solidified the general public's belief in this regard. Nevertheless, within the Politburo, Stalin was considered Lenin's designated successor. Stalin, conversely, had acquired the position of Central Committee General Secretary as Lenin's health declined, granting him immense patronage powers within the government. From 1922 until Lenin's death in January 1924, Stalin labored to forge a coalition within the Politburo in support of himself and to undermine Trotsky's position. Additionally, he oversaw the establishment of the Union during this time. Stalin's support was significantly bolstered by the establishment of a triumvirate consisting of himself, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, and 2 other senior members of the Politburo. It was believed that by opposing Trotsky's succession to Lenin, this triumvirate would jointly possess a substantial amount of power in a post-Lenin world. Lenin harbored substantial suspicions regarding Stalin, to the extent that he amended his last will and testament in 1923, just prior to his 3rd stroke rendered him incapacitated, to caution the party against Stalin and designate Trotsky as his successor as head of the Soviet state. However, By mid-1923, Stalin's monopoly on power had progressed unnecessarily. He had utilized his position as General Secretary to appoint his adherents to numerous mid-ranking positions, and his influence had spread far enough. Initially, the demise of Lenin in January 1924 appeared to bring about minimal overt alterations in the operations of the Soviet government. After all, the revolutionary government's inaugural leader had been essentially incapacitated for months prior to his death, and the Politburo appeared to continue governing by consensus, as it had done in 1922 and 1923. Nevertheless, the initiated, the Troika of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, perceived the situation to be quite different. Furthermore, 1 year following Lenin's demise, Trotsky's weakened status was officially acknowledged and declared public when, on January 6, 1925, he was dismissed from his roles as Commissar of Military and Naval Affairs and Chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council. Prior to that date, Trotsky had held this position since 1917. It is worth noting that Trotsky was arguably the most influential figure in the formulation of the October Revolution. Although Trotsky managed to maintain his position as a member of the Politburo, he progressively encountered estrangement from any substantive authority within the Soviet regime. In 1925, Trotsky experienced a progressive decline in prominence and distanced himself from influential circles and effective power. He was no longer a part of the decision-making processes he had previously been a part of, and was no longer affiliated with the Troika consisting of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. Upon Stalin's betrayal of his former allies later that year, Trotsky's contribution to the subsequent schemes that precipitated their demise was minimal. The dissolution of Stalin's alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev marked the culmination of the struggle for power in the years following Lenin and, ultimately, the last acts of Trotsky's revolutionary career in his native Russia. In December 1925, at the 14th Congress of the Bolshevik Party in Moscow, he formed the new opposition, with Kamenev and Zinoviev, in opposition to Stalin and his faction. The speeches exposed the fact that this was now a struggle for party control. The opposition to Stalin's monopoly of power within the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state ultimately perished in 1927. Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Central Committee in October 1927. Subsequently, they attempted to coordinate counter-events commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik takeover of power in October 1917. However, these plans were foiled by the police. As a result, Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Communist Party in early November 1927. In the end, Kamenev and Zinoviev submitted to Stalin during the 15th Party Congress in December 1927. Trotsky, on the other hand, refused. As a result, he was exiled from Russia permanently in January 1928 and subsequently relocated to Kazakhstan, situated east of the Caspian Sea. A year later, he was deported to Turkey. Thus, the lifelong revolutionary was once more deprived of Russia. Russia descended into anarchy, terror, and bloodshed during the 1930s, when Trotsky was last exiled. As Stalin consolidated his grip on power, other dissenters who supported Trotsky's approach to communism in the years that followed frequently faced arduous penal labor in Siberia, and many more were either vanished or executed by Stalin's regime. This reign of cruelty reached its zenith with the Moscow show trials. The assassination of senior Bolshevik politician Sergei Kirov on December 1, 1934, was a pretext for the removal of Stalin's former allies, Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev. Having formed the Troika with Stalin in the mid-1920s, Zinoviev assisted Stalin in reducing Trotsky's influence within the party. Both Kamenev and Zinoviev were arrested, convicted of their involvement in Kirov's murder, and executed by firing squad on August 25, 1936. Stalin and his secret police wiped out all opposition to the regime in Russia during the Great Purge or Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, labeling individuals as Trotskyists and state opponents. In total, 1.2 million people perished during this period, either through judicial executions or, more frequently, in the abhorrent conditions of Stalin's forced labor camps, known to history as the Gulag. As a result, Trotsky managed to outlive the majority of those who had remained in Russia and opposed Stalin in any way. Following his flight from Russia, he resided in Turkey for 4 years, followed by France for 2 years from 1933 to 1935. Subsequently, the French authorities influenced his decision to travel to Norway, but he was deported to Mexico in early 1937 due to official pressure from Russia. It was his final exile destination, and it was also where he passed away in 1940. During his final years of exile, he maintained a busy writing schedule, completing a number of books including an autobiography and a history of the Russian Revolution. While in Mexico, he collaborated with the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States and gained the support of Chinese Communist Party members who were engaged in a protracted and bitter struggle for power. Furthermore, in 1938, he and his supporters established the Fourth International Communist Organization. Trotsky's demise was almost certainly the result of his unceasing revolutionary zeal and this continued activity. Stalin, fueled by the paranoia that plagued all of Russia in the 1930s, resolved in the late decade to permanently sever ties with Trotsky. Even in distant Mexico City, Trotsky managed to survive a Stalinist assassination attempt on his home on May 24, 1940. However, another Stalinist agent achieved success 3 months later. On August 20, 1940, Trotsky's residence in Mexico City was breached by Ramon Mercader, a Stalinist agent, who proceeded to inflict an ice axe wound upon Trotsky's head. The blow was administered inadequately, and Trotsky did not succumb to his injuries in a hospital in Mexico City until the day after. Leon Trotsky, an individual originally named Lev Bronstein but widely recognized as Leon Trotsky, was a highly intriguing figure in Russian history. An unwavering socialist and advocate of communism, he devoted his entire adult life to the cause, twice evading exile to the penal colonies of Siberia and traversing 15 years as a revolutionary nomad between Russia, London, Vienna, Switzerland, and the United States prior to his eventual return. He played a pivotal role in the subsequent civil conflicts that ensued after the establishment of the Soviet Union, essentially becoming the most influential figure in the early professionalization and evolution of the Red Army into a formidable revolutionary force. However, Trotsky's intellectual prowess and aptitudes transcended his pragmatic influence on the government of early Soviet Russia. He was instrumental in shaping the very essence of communism during the 20th century, most notably through the theory of permanent revolution, which had a lasting impact on communist thinkers in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. However, Trotsky also possessed a paradoxical quality. Despite appearing to be a humane individual at times, dedicated to the welfare of the proletariat and workers' rights, he could be ruthless in his support for the revolution, as evidenced by his conception of blocking units within the Red Army. In the power struggle that ensued after Lenin's death in the mid-1920s, however, Stalin's ruthlessness surpassed Trotsky's. Ultimately, Trotsky was victorious, and his later years were a bit of a letdown, as he was once more exiled from Russia while his rival for power plunged the new Soviet state into years of autocracy, repression, and bloodshed. In your opinion, what is Leon Trotsky? Could the worst excesses of Stalin's regime have been avoided in the annals of Soviet Russia had he been a humane revolutionary? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.